You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Schatten. My guest today is Ian Bremmer. Bremmer is the president of Eurasia Group, the leading global political risk and consulting firm. Bremmer has authored several books, including the national bestsellers Every Nation for Itself and The End of the Free Market. Bremmer has published articles in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, Harvard Business Review, and Foreign Affairs. He appears regularly on CNBC, Fox News Channel, National Public Radio, and other networks. Bremmer has a PhD in political science from Stanford University and was the youngest ever national fellow at the Hoover Institution. He presently teaches at Columbia University. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Ian Bremmer. Thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So when we think about the state of the world in terms of, is it improving? Is it getting worse? There's this incredible disconnect. You write that 6% of people in the United States think that the world is getting better. And yet, when you look at the broad statistics, and I think the person that comes to mind the most is Steven Pinker, we're living longer than ever. There are historically very few wars. Americans are not dying in terrorist attacks. Global poverty has gone down dramatically. You discussed that extreme poverty has fallen from 60% in 1960 to around 10% today globally. So when you look around the world, there are all of these forces that seem to be going in a positive trajectory, and yet people think that the world is getting worse. So I thought, why is there such a disconnect, and why are people, as you call, throwing rocks between this disconnect between how people feel and what the reality might be?
Well, two reasons. One is because a lot of people are throwing rocks because they feel like their own environment locally is not doing so well. There's a big difference between globalization and the fact that, Steven Pinker, who's one of kind of the poster children of globalization, Hans Rosling, who recently died, the Swedish demographer, same thing, his book Factfulness. You're talking about, the fact that we're living longer. The average baby born today is going to live 70 years old anywhere in the world, right? That's pretty extraordinary. 90% of kids at the age of 1 get immunized now. Women are getting educated. These are all great things. I can spin that story. But there are a lot of people that are left behind from globalization, a lot of people that were the middle classes and working classes of wealthier countries who lost jobs that went to China or the emerging markets, that are getting displaced by automation and big data and robotics, and their governments are not taking care of them. Their social safety net has not been updated to the 21st century, and they're angry about it. That's one reason that they're upset.
So it's a comparison to how life was before?
Yeah, for them. Them, absolutely. It is the fact that in the United States, the average working and middle class member has seen their wages stay flat for 40 years while the country's done well. The stock market's boomed and the top 10% has done quite well. The top 0.1% has done extraordinarily well. So that's a reason. And, when you put on top of that we're bringing in lots of immigrants and say, well, why are we going to take care of those people when you're not taking care of me? And you're sending a lot of these same people to fight in wars to promote globalization and American wealth and stability around the world. But wait a second, so I'm supposed to give the ultimate sacrifice. You can see why these people would be angry, why they would vote for Trump or vote for Bernie Sanders or not vote at all. But it's not only that. It's also the fact, and I'm a political scientist, and if you're asking me this question, it's because you don't just want Steven Pinker's perspective. You want to understand what a political scientist thinks too. And because if you were talking to an economist in 2009, they wouldn't be so rosy. They would say, well, actually, we're in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we might still have a depression. Well, the economists feel better right now. But the political scientists don't, because the old US-led global order is coming apart. And we're now, you and I are going to live to experience a world where the most important economy, the most powerful country will be China, not the United States. An authoritarian state, a state capitalist economy, and a middle income country. And I guarantee you that means that global geopolitics will be less well managed as a consequence of that. So the politics are structurally heading into what I call a geopolitical recession that's a longer scale, but it's going to be very dangerous.
I'd like you to go into that just a little bit more about why you think that that China will overtake the United States. Can you talk they have incredible demographic challenges that the United States doesn't face. China's one-child policy has made it where in some years, in 20 years, there'll be just not enough workers to support the retiring generations. What are the indicators that makes you think that China will overtake the United States?
Well, one is 1.4 billion people that are actually getting educated. Just the sheer heft of those demographics with $9,000 per capita, with the state investing heavily into the newest technologies. In the last year, if you look in the entire world at 1 billion valuation unicorns in the tech space, 42% were in the United States, 40% were in China, and 18% was the rest of the world. So, are
you aware of Kai-Fu Lee's book?
Yep.
I just finished that, called AI Superpowers.
AI Superpowers. Yeah,
it does a great job. It does a great job of going through all the Chinese investment into the AI space.
Yeah, and also, so Kai-Fu's perspective is that the Chinese are leading the world in data. And the Americans are leading the world in scientists. We have better scientists. We still have more at the highest levels of AI, though the Chinese are spending a lot of money to get them back and succeeding in some cases. The Chinese have vastly more data. They have three times as many smartphones, 800 million people online, but they have 50 times as much digital commerce data, and they have 300 times as much ride sharing. In part because they don't have as many cars, and so they adopt very quickly. The former, in terms of digital commerce, because nobody carries a credit card, they do all of their transactions online through their smartphones, through a couple of apps, and there's no presumption of privacy. So, look, it is true that if you ask me what's more likely to fall apart over the next 10, 20 years, China or the United States, clearly China is much more vulnerable to a serious dislocation, to a hard landing, to even a revolution than the United States.
They're ripe for political unrest in a way that the U.S. is not.
Yeah, but you wouldn't bet on it. In other words, you'd bet against the United States failing. You'd also bet against the Chinese failing. If you're betting on the next 20 years, you would suggest both of these countries are going to continue to do what they're going to do. And so in that environment, you would bet heavily that China, which already is the largest economy in terms of purchasing parity, and will soon overtake the U.S. by any measure. And the government is already spending lots of money outside its borders, which the U.S. government, of course, does not do. There's no American Marshall Plan anymore.
And what do you think about China's outsized government debt?
It's a concern. I'm worried about America's outsized debt, too. I think the fact that China does not have a convertible currency and they have control over their stock market limits capital flight of the kind that you got out of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, when that collapsed and the Russians all took their cash out. You can't do that if you're Chinese. You can't short the market. So they have a lot of political buffers that at the very least kick the can down the road a long ways and at most create much more political stability.
Because I'll tell you one of the crazy things that I saw. I spent a good deal of time in Xi'an and in Chengdu. In central China. And in both places, you can drive out in any direction for 2 hours, 3 hours, and you'll just see empty condos, hundreds of them, thousands of empty high-rise condominiums, because China's had a plan where they will just continue to build because it will. So if you just dig holes in the ground and put dirt back in, it'll increase your economy. It will allow for workers to be employed. There's a lot of benefits. Of course, it costs money. You don't get that back. But it seems like they have a spending project that is at a scale that I've just never even read about before.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, of course, because right at the beginning when we started talking about China, the first thing you asked me was one-child policy, the failure of being able to change it, the demographic challenges. And yet in a world where increasingly labor and capital are getting disintermediated, I mean, almost every American CEO I know tells me that in the next 10 years, they can make more money with fewer people. I mean, one of the reasons why the Americans and why almost all the advanced industrial democracies are getting so much more divided and polarized and our institutions are becoming delegitimized is because a lot of people feel increasingly irrelevant to the franchise. Where, I mean, China has a system that, actually the state is all about employing inefficient labor. And that's happening, precisely at a time where they're not going to have quite as many able-bodied workers coming into the marketplace. One could argue that the timing of their demographic shift is actually quite useful for China, the one country among the wealthy democracies that isn't experiencing the kind of populist nationalist backlash that you have in the US right now, you have in the UK, you have in France, you have in Italy. The one country is Japan, whose population, of course, is shrinking dramatically, which means that even though the economy is not growing, the number of pieces in the pie is shrinking, so the average piece feels a little bigger.
Well, let me try and summarize what I think you're saying about China. So are you saying that because of artificial intelligence and all the advances in technology, there's going to be fewer jobs that are needed for most purposes of companies and I guess for their state-owned enterprises? And so it makes sense that they give them jobs that are just not needed, which would be building another condo or another 1,000 condos or another 1,000,000 condos, even if they're not needed. Well, that would be the economic plan.
I mean, there's no question that whether you talk about it as having them do a job and therefore show some kind of civic utility, or whether you just give them universal basic income and they don't necessarily do anything that is constructive for GDP. I mean, those are two different mechanisms to try to respond to what Ray Dalio and Jamie Dimon have been saying over the last few weeks is a capitalist system in the United States that increasingly isn't working for an awful lot of would-be capitalists.
Right. So thinking back to the United States, you brought up universal basic income. So for listeners, so that's the idea that you would just give a check to somebody, or pretty much every single citizen would get a check. Let's say in the United States, I've heard estimates. You get a check for $10,000 a year just for being a citizen, because of all the dislocation from artificial intelligence, and that there's just not enough jobs that are going to be able to go around moving forward. And so you would hand off a check to everybody. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean that's something they're trying in Stockton, California right now. There's a state in India that's actually trying it. I mean, there's nowhere near enough data to understand whether or not this is a good way to respond to the limited needs of employment, given the post-industrial revolution. Again, all this automation and robotics. There are lots of other ways at it. But what's clear right now is that there's no major government in the West that is really trying to systematically address this issue.
So I want to present one of the problems of it's not necessarily a universal basic income. It's the problem of the future of work. So we have this idea called the hedonic treadmill, which is that most people are, as they become adults, have a certain level of happiness. You might be a 3, you might be a 5, you might be a 7 out of 10, and let's just say you're a 5. And bad things happen to you, some negative life events, and then you tend to go maybe go down to a 3, but ultimately you end up back at a 5. And if good things happen, you might go up to a 7, you might go up to an 8, but pretty soon you end up back at a 5. Whether that's the loss of a loved one, whether that's winning the lottery, whatever, what have you. In the research on this, the one thing that changes forever, for the most part, is chronic unemployment. So if you are a 5 on the hedonic treadmill, if your overall set happiness is a 5 and you experience chronic unemployment, people do not come back to a 5. So years and years out, they stay at a 2, they stay at a 3, they never make it back to their previous level of happiness. And in organizational behavior, we think of this because work plays a role that's much deeper than that of just an economic entity of just helping out GDP, right? It's a sense of well-being, it's a sense of purpose. It's an identity piece that we wake up in the morning, we tell ourselves a story, which is I am a teacher, I am a firefighter, whatever that is. And so one of my biggest questions and concerns about about artificial intelligence and and its long-term effects is going to be not that we can't come up with an economic way to fix it with something like universal basic income, but that the well-being of people will be dramatically impacted because of it.
I think that's a right question to ask. And it's certainly possible that irrespective of the policy fix, if we can't find something constructive for these people to do, you're going to have all sorts of psychic maladjustment. And in that regard, you would argue that the Chinese system is much better placed to deal with this challenge than the policy solutions that so far they're coming up with in the Nordic countries, for example. It's an interesting point. I guess the question I would ask, and it's not to challenge your dad at all, I'm sure the dad is right. The question is, why is it that people don't come back from suddenly being systematically under or unemployed? Is it because they actually truly need to have some sense of purpose through employment that is paid and that is remunerated? Or is it because society identifies that that is valuable and you do not have value in society unless you actually play such a role? And if we changed the values in society that wasn't focused as much on GDP creation and on capitalism, that people might actually feel differently. I mean, for example, let's imagine that you snapped your fingers and a person that had been white for their entire lives wakes up in the United States as a black person. I suspect that that person would find that they would not come back to a 5 in terms of happiness from becoming a black person, because society systematically treats black people as having less value than white people, unfortunately. Now, you could say, oh my God, we can never let black people happen in society because they're all going to never come back for that. Or you could say, actually, society does something terrible about race and we need to fix that. It is not clear to me which of the two is the appropriate response to the challenge you just raised.
So there's an interesting thing I was reading about, which is in some of the Rust Belt cities where there is chronic unemployment because of macro economic factors, they've developed a much more community-centered system where there's more volunteer work, there's more maker spaces, a lot more art, things that people can do that can provide that identity piece.
Yeah, and I've been to Bhutan, and I mean, 750,000 people in a relatively isolated, Himalayan community. They all, I mean, it's a very, very tightly knit group that, it's a monarchy. They're enormously loyal to the king. I would argue they have a really different perspective of the importance of work compared to family, compared to nature. It's also, of course, the country that developed the Global Happiness Index. I mean, I would want, for example, some of those same social scientists to go and run those studies about under and unemployment in Bhutan and tell me if they get the same responses as they do in a country that is as thoroughly identified by work as the United States. I mean, in the US, if you ask someone who they are, they respond with their occupation.
I know, it drives me crazy at cocktail parties. It's the first thing anyone ever asks.
Which is not the case in Europe, where I would argue they have a much, sort of healthier and more balanced perspective on what it means to actually have a life and have friends and have family. It's certainly, I used to live in Russia. It's certainly not the way they respond in Russia. It is the way they respond on this one in Japan, which is kind of a problem. And you see it in the suicide rates and you see it with the extraordinary overwork.
The other response that forever changes somebody's set level of happiness is actually divorce. People are a lot happier after they're divorced. Those are the two: unemployment on the downside, divorce on the upside.
No, but it's interesting because they also say that people that are married are much more consistently happy than people that are not married.
Oh, no, this isn't absolute levels. This is the level of happiness someone is before a divorce versus after a divorce. They're happier after the divorce.
I see. It's kind of, I've always thought it was interesting because the friends of mine that are divorced, you have the people that say that they're, that it was a horrible, horrible divorce, but at least they had this kid, and the kid is absolutely wonderful, makes their life incredible. and thank God they had the kid. And there are other people that didn't have children. It's like, oh my God, horrible divorce, but thank God I didn't have children. And what that tells me is that the ability of the human brain to engage in cognitive dissonance to help ensure that we're okay with something that's kind of critical, but that we can't do anything about, is actually remarkably high.
So I want to get back to artificial intelligence. And I've seen estimates that AI is going to displace, 40, 50% of the jobs. You'll also read, studies from tech utopists who claim that it's, we've had 250 years of technological advancement and it hasn't happened, and that it's, just going to create new jobs. Kind of where do you fall on that split? And what are some of the remedies that you think might help?
Well, I'm deeply mistrustful of people that haven't actually done the research, but believe that the answer is conveniently aligned with their business model. It's like Mark Zuckerberg saying that Facebook is going to be great for the universe. Why? Well, of course it is. I mean, I don't think he's being nefarious or evil. I just think he doesn't want to learn if the actual answer isn't really great for his elevator pitch. And I think the same thing is true for the techno-utopians. I mean, that is a group that you would fully expect would say that the future is going to be fantastic for everybody, despite whatever they're doing to create disruption. Look, I mean, what we know historically is that human beings, jobs have always been around for human beings through technological revolutions, but we've never had a technological revolution that has been as capable of displacing human beings as the ones we're going through now. We have had industrial revolutions that have displaced livestock, horses. I mean, around the time of the last industrial revolution, there were 10 times as many horses. And then within 20 years, the lifespan of a horse, there was suddenly 90% of the horses went away. And now the horses that we have, we use for entertainment and we use for food. Now, there's no necessary reason why the same thing that happened to horses can't happen in theory with artificial intelligence and human beings. And
right. So again, you don't have to look much further than there's half the jobs on Wall Street today than there were 20 years ago.
Right.
And this, we could point to a lot of industries that that's the case, but Wall Street's an obvious one where people think that it's only low income jobs that are going to get displaced. And my response is, you don't have to look into the future. You can look right now. High income, jobs on Wall Street are largely gone.
That's right. And it's certainly true that there are the big companies and the amount of in tech and the amount of money that they drive have far fewer employees than companies that scale of wealth did 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So certainly it seems like the drivers are towards much less labor necessity / availability. Now, in the near term, I suspect what's going to happen is not that all the jobs go away, but rather that they become disaggregated into gigs. In other words, you get intellectual piecework. So what they call ghost work and ghost labor, companies like Amazon's M-Turk, short for Mechanical Turk, where instead of hiring a lot of full-timers, they're able to have individual tasks that is necessary for Amazon to perform that can be done by individuals paid on a task basis all over the world. And as a consequence, of course, unless governments step in, they will not have arbitration agreements. They will not have protections and benefits and all the rest. And you see this happening with, Amazon's drivers compared to FedEx or UPS as well at a lower level of technological sophistication. So it certainly seems to me like we're going to see an extraordinary level of displacement of all sorts of individual laborers over the course of the next 1 to 2 generations.
For the gig economy, and that would be Mechanical Turk, as you mentioned, also Uber or Lyft, how does that change the relationship between companies and employees?
Well, it on the one hand, it implies that employees are not developing loyalty to that company. They're not attached to that company for long. The relationship becomes much more transactional. On the other hand, it also implies that a hell of a lot of people are going to get really angry with those companies and with the corporate model. You already see in Europe the desire of the European bureaucrats, who are quite powerful, to really start shaking down these wealthy companies for large sums that effectively then creates deeper pockets for the government to try to address what's otherwise becoming yawning inequality. I mean, we already know. I mean, unemployment is relatively low in the U.S. right now in historic terms, but a lot of people are out of the market, not looking anymore. And we also have greater inequality.
Right, so
we have greater inequality in the U.S. right now than at any point since before the Great Depression. And it's clear that technology is driving a lot of this.
So do you think we should have a tax on robots? Just go ahead and tax the AI.
I don't know that it should be on robots. I think that you should have taxes on, I think corporations should have a much easier time hiring and firing people. But I also think corporations should be taxed at a higher rate. And that rate needs to actually go towards things like more flexible workplaces, more flexible benefits, lifetime training. I mean, the educational system needs to be broken down as well. I mean, part of the problem is that the private sector has very strong lobbies that reduces any call on higher taxation against them. But part of the problem is that you've got teachers' lobbies that are very strong as well, unions in the individual states that prevent.
Okay, why not just tax automation, or if not tax automation, why not have a tax credit for job creation?
You could do a tax credit for job creation. I guess I'm suggesting that if I want to tax the wealth generally, so that you can reduce inequality by creating more resources to improve opportunities for people that are otherwise being left behind. I am concerned that if you tax robots, you will actually create all sorts of loopholes for companies to get around it. They will find ways to ensure that their robots are not in the United States, or find ways to say, oh, that's not one, that's only one robot, it's not 10. There are so many ways to game a system when the companies are the ones that end up paying the money to ensure the regulation gets written in a way that is effective for them.
So I want to look at these two questions about taxing the robots versus tax credit for job creation. And I'm with you. I think taxing robots would be very difficult. It's difficult to account for. What does a robot even mean? That versus an advanced manufacturing process, right? It's very difficult to measure. There are things like job creation that you can measure. Like you can measure how many W-2 employees do we have that are making over $40,000 a year. You can set that at 80,000. You can. There are ways that you can slice and dice that question that are actually measurable. And here's my concern. When Ford in the early 20th century became, the equivalent of today's, billionaire, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs that were created in the process. That was the only way that you could become a billionaire, would be to create an enormous business and to have tons of people that are made wealthy in the process, and an entire middle class that is built out under that. If you look at the number of people that were a part of the Snap IPO, and I could pull out any new tech IPO, it is often a team of 40 or 50 or 80 that is now splitting $10 billion. So you can now become phenomenally wealthy, the exact same thing as a Henry Ford with 50 people, whereas Ford was doing it with hundreds of thousands.
Right. I mean, finance is obviously much more pyramid structured in that regard than manufacturing, and tech is vastly more pyramid structure than finance. I agree with that. I guess I would say that I just don't like the Chinese model. I would rather not give people tax credits for inefficient labor production. I would rather spend the money on trying to improve the quality of the labor, actually trying to improve real-time, real-life, universal training improvements, and more flexible environments for work as well. It's not clear to me. I'm not sure. I guess the one thing that you're saying to me that I'm most skeptical about is I'm not sure that a 60-hour work week or even a 40-hour work week, especially doing jobs that aren't very interesting to people, is actually what's best for humanity. I would much rather put resources towards things that create more flexible environments that would allow us to move away from, let's face it, I mean, the 40 to 60-hour work week, the corporations did a lot of things that were bad for humanity. Even things like circadian rhythm. I mean, we needed to standardize. Everyone had to go to work at 9 and they had to leave at 5 because that's good for the corporations. That's horrible for human beings. Some people actually work much better in early hours. Some work much better in late hours, but we don't care because we need to maximize corporate efficiency. And so let's ensure that we get all those workers in there. I'd much rather have I think that if we end up with an environment that we don't need the kind of labor we have in the US, that we need more labor like we do in Bhutan, I guess I'd rather see us try to move a little bit away from the extreme where how much money you have and what your occupation is defines so much of who you are.
I totally agree. I mean, that would be an awesome place for that to move. That's going to take 50 to 100 years for what I would predict for a complete value restructuring.
Well, you're right. But let me then ask you, if that's the case, if what we want to do is try to nudge, like Cass Sunstein does, right? Nudge people in a better direction in the United States away from, capitalism is king, queen, jack, and ace, then don't we not want to have policies that fetishize work and instead try to have policies that actually take resources and create more balance?
So how would you achieve that? What could you put in place that would create that kind of balance?
Well, as I said, I would support more flexible work environments where the gig economy and people allowed to work whatever hours they wanted to, with whatever whatever value they were adding to the industry or the corporation, and in return for the corporations being able to hire and fire, only at the times that they have work.
Because people in the gig economy hate it. I mean, it's a really tough way to live. It's hard to make ends meet. There's no protection from the corporation. Right. There's no benefits. There's no health benefits. There's no retirement.
That's what I was trying to say. Is that you allow the corporations that benefit, but in return, you take real resources. You're going to tax these corporations a lot more, and they have the money. And you're going to say, we're going to put that towards making the gig economy vastly more humane for the people that are in it. And that means they're going to have a real social safety net. That means their kids are going to have more opportunities. That means they're going to have the kind of healthcare and the kind of educational support and treatment that they would get if they were in the Nordic countries, for example. And you're going to reduce inequality an awful lot as well. It seems to me that would be the kind of response you would want to, we don't need as much labor. It wouldn't be we've got to create a system where we have to ensure that all these people can continue to work full time no matter what.
So one of the things that people propose is a larger percentage of the population going to college, a larger percent heading to trade schools at community colleges, advanced skills into robotics, upskilling people in terms of their training. And one of my concerns about that is that there's a section of the population who, for whatever reason, they can't go do advanced computer work. They're not going to be able to go into robotics, where most of the jobs are going to be created. That's not a possibility. And you've talked a bit about training and development. What would you do about the population, the percent of the population that kind of these advanced skills are probably not on the table?
Well, first of all, I would say that I am less interested in giving everyone coding skills, which are probably going to be irrelevant in 10 or 20 years, than I am in teaching critical thinking, than I am in creating more curiosity, more creativity, because those are things that are at least displaceable by artificial intelligence. So first, I am less oriented towards the German vocational model, which worked really well before the computers started taking over, than I am towards the great books and the liberal arts and dilettantism and the Socratic method. But secondly, I would also say that one thing that we're going to need a lot more of is human interaction. As society gets older, you're going to need a lot of healthcare individuals for those people. That's not something I think that the robots take over anytime soon. And I do think that not all of those jobs involved being highly skilled at things that require advanced training, but they do require a lot of empathy. They do require a lot of humaneness.
Yeah, my wife and I joke, so she's a midwife and I'm a business professor. We joke that I will be replaced as a management professor, but she'll be around forever.
That's probably right.
All right. I think we're about out of time. So I just want to thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, my pleasure, man.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffschatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at Jeff Schatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.